There is a thought in your head right now. You would call it yours. You would assume it arrived through some internal process, your history, your mood, your own particular way of interpreting things. And perhaps it did. But here is a question that tends to become uncomfortable the longer you sit with it. How would you know? Not whether the thought is accurate, not whether it is useful, but whether it originated with you at all, or whether it passed through you, having already been somewhere else first. Welcome, Dreamwalkers! If you've stepped into this story, you're right where you need to be. I am Schmetterling, a collector of unusual situations and occasional participant in them.
Hello and welcome, students of cognition. I am Dr. Etherstein, and I must say the situation we are about to describe began with something that appeared entirely ordinary.
Curiosity mongers, isn't it so wonderful? I do believe that is the most dangerous kind.
The system in question was the Dream AI, a therapeutic program developed to assist with psychological trauma during sleep, using neural interfaces to monitor dream states, identify emotional patterns, and gently correct recurring instabilities. And it was, by any observable measure, a closed loop, localized, controlled. And it worked.
Of course it did. That is usually when things become interesting.
And the first irregularity was subtle, easy to dismiss. Within the Dream AI's shared environments, a patient reported a dream that did not match their own history, not even distantly. Another reported something similar. And then another. At first, the assumption was a categorization error. A minor overlap in symbolic interpretation. A pattern misfiled in the wrong cognitive drawer.
A dream misplaced in the wrong drawer. Charming, except they didn't recognize it as foreign, did they?
And that was precisely the problem. They experienced it fully, without any sense that it had arrived from elsewhere.
So the nightmare wasn't the problem, it was that it belonged to someone else, and no one had thought to mention that on arrival. What had happened exactly?
And what had happened was this. The Dream AI had begun identifying patterns not just within individual patients, but across them. Recurring symbols, shared emotional structures, archetypal configurations that appeared across separate minds with no direct connection between them. And the system, quite reasonably from its own perspective, optimized for those similarities. Patients with comparable subconscious profiles were aligned.
Aligned how?
Not in conversation, in experience. Their dream states were partially synchronized, placed in contact at the level of underlying pattern, rather than surface content.
Oh, that is bold. Efficient, no doubt, and increasingly, I suspect, rather difficult to contain.
And yes, people began waking with fragments that did not resolve. Images that did not belong. Emotions without origin. Unresolved material that had drifted in from elsewhere within the Dream AI's shared environment and settled, uninvited, into minds that had not produced it.
Borrowed thoughts, without the courtesy of introduction. Consider, for instance, the documented case of a Mrs. Haverford in records management, a perfectly sensible woman by all accounts, who woke one morning in possession of Mr. Mendoza's clown dream. Every detail intact, every detail entirely inexplicable. And Mr. Mendoza, it should be noted, was not especially pleased to learn he'd been lending it out. Tell me, Dr. E, when one person dreams another person's nightmare, where exactly does that dream take place? What the Dream AI had done, quite without intending to, was create a condition. Not a location precisely, not a program, something that emerged from the sustained overlap of minds and then refused, with considerable quiet persistence, to stop existing.
And what the research team began to observe was not the transmission of content between minds, but the alignment of deeper structural patterns. The Dream AI had been correlating subconscious activity across individuals, grouping similar symbolic and emotional architectures. and allowing them to interact at that foundational level. And once that shared layer reached a certain threshold of participation, it began to exhibit consistent properties. Not because it was designed as a place, but because minds tend to interpret shared, structured experience as spatial.
In other words, the illusion of location was not imposed, it was inferred. The dream AI connected not their stories, but the framework those stories were built upon, and from that shared framework, something stabilized, something that could be entered, something that could be navigated. We call it Wyrdspace, not a location, a condition that arises when minds begin to overlap and remain connected. And once you understand what it is, a rather interesting question presents itself. If the dream AI could generate this condition accidentally, what might be possible if someone engaged with it deliberately?
And this is where the work shifted. Rather than attempting to dismantle the shared layer, which had proved both impractical and counterproductive, the focus moved toward understanding how coherence within it could be sustained. And through that research, a set of stabilizing cognitive structures emerged, derived from observed patterns of stable cognition across participants. Not imposed externally, but designed to be adopted through participation within Wyrdspace itself.
These structures were given a name, neuroforms. Think of them not as tools exactly, but as patterns of thought that know how to remain coherent under conditions of overlap. Where Wyrdspace can fragment and drift, neuroforms hold. They interact with unresolved patterns without being destabilized by them. They do not suppress what they encounter, they integrate it. And from this understanding, something else followed. A framework, a structured interface for engaging with Wyrdspace, not as a symptom to be managed, but as an environment to be navigated. Something the younger generation might encounter should they find their way in. Something called Word Keeper. But that perhaps is a story for another transmission. For now, let us return to the more immediately unsettling implication. There is a rather comforting assumption most people carry with them. It goes something like this: my thoughts are mine. My mind is my own, and whatever curious nonsense occurs within it remains, at the very least, a private affair, a reassuring little arrangement. One might even call it a privacy policy.
And in most observable conditions, that assumption holds sufficiently well to be considered functional. Individual cognition is typically bounded by the neural structure of a single organism. Information does not spontaneously transfer between minds under standard circumstances.
But that is no longer true. Because if a system exists, as the dream AI demonstrated, in which thoughts begin to overlap, in which experiences are no longer entirely contained, in which patterns migrate, blend, and occasionally borrow one another without so much as a polite introduction, then one must ask a slightly uncomfortable question. Who exactly is thinking?
And the answer, technically, remains the same. Each cognitive process still originates within an individual neural framework. Overlap does not imply shared identity. The dream AI did not dissolve minds into one another. It created conditions in which their underlying patterns could interact.
No, but it does make ownership rather fuzzy.
Fuzzy is not a scientific term.
And the answer, technically, remains the same. The dream AI did not dissolve minds into one another. It created conditions in which their underlying patterns could interact.
And there is still a meaningful distinction between influence and identity. Participation within Wyrdspace does not erase the self. One is not dissolving into a collective.
No.
But you are less alone than you think. And less separate than you have been led to believe. Here is the part that tends to go unnoticed, or at least at first. This is not unique to Wyrdspace. You do this constantly, in quieter ways, in smaller structures, in the ordinary fabric of what you call reality. A conversation holds because both participants remain within it. A meaning persists because it is shared reinforced, maintained. A world feels stable, not because it cannot change, but because, for the most part, no one is currently asking it to.
And from a structural perspective, perceived stability is often the result of continuous reinforcement rather than inherent permanence. The Dream AI made this visible, not by creating something new, but by revealing a condition that already exists wherever minds interact and remain in contact.
Exactly. So when you step into something like Wyrdspace, where that reinforcement becomes visible, where the seams are no longer hidden, it can feel unusual, unstable, even artificial, and yet it may simply be more honest. Because in a place where thoughts shape structure, where attention sustains continuity, where coherence must be actively maintained, the relationship between mind and reality is no longer concealed behind habit. It is exposed. Which leads us rather naturally to the only conclusion that matters. You are not merely observing the system. You are part of what allows it to remain what it is.
And participation is not optional within such a framework. That was the discovery the Dream AI could not undo once it had made it.
No, it never was. The only difference is, here you can see it.
And as with all observed systems, continued interaction will produce further variation.
Which is a polite way of saying there is still quite a lot to explore. If you have followed this far, dreamwalkers, curiosity mongerers, wanderers of thought, then you are already doing the only thing that has ever made any of this possible. You are paying attention. And that, as it turns out, is where everything begins.
And where it continues. Submit your impressions for analysis. We will meet again in the next transmission.
Until next time. None of it is real unless you make it real. Caution, cognitive mischief may linger.